Hello and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today, whether you are in person or joining us virtually. We have Matthew Teller today to tell us about his new book, Nine Quarters of Jerusalem, as well as Saeed Ariqat to moderate the event, who is a member of the Palestine Center Committee and the Washington Bureau Chief for the Palestinian newspaper Al-Quds, a daily for which he is a writer, columnist, and an analyst. He previously served as spokesman and director of public information for the United Nations Assistance Mission for Iraq. He currently teaches as an adjunct professor at American University in Washington, D.C. And Teller, a freelance journalist, documentary maker who writes for the BBC, The Guardian, Times of London, Financial Times, and other global media. He has produced and presented documentaries for the BBC Radio. He is the author of several travel guides, including The Rough Guide for Jordan. His previous book was Quite Alone, Journalism for the Middle East, 2008-2019. He's here to talk about his new book, again, Nine Quarters of Jerusalem, where he combines millennia of Jerusalem's history with insightful interviews with its residents, weaponizing that unusual approach to present a subtle portrait of the current reality at the heart of the world's most intractable and divisive conflict. I won't talk too much about it. I will leave it all to Matthew. Thank you for being here today again, and I'll leave it to you.
Thanks so much. Thank you very, very much indeed. Firas and Saham and Dorokaya and all the colleagues here at the Jerusalem Fund, the Palestine Center in DC, for making this happen. It's a massive privilege for me to be here. I'm very lucky to have been on tour around the United States for the last 2 or 3 weeks or so. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you everyone also for coming today, and thank you for people who are watching on Zoom. Just before I begin, as I'm touring the US, I'm also helping to spread the word about the American Friends of the Spafford Children's Center, which is a unique organization that's been running in the old city of Jerusalem, supporting underprivileged Palestinian children in particular and families for 100 years, give or take. Wendy, who is the executive director of the American Friends of the Spafford Center, is with us in person here today. She's very happy to answer any questions anybody has after the event. There's some literature at the desk in the front there, also about the Spafford Center, and I'd urge you, if you can, to consider supporting them. I want to acknowledge that Washington, D.C. is located on the traditional and ancestral homelands of the Piscataway and Anacostan peoples who are still here. Please take a moment to consider the legacies of more than 150 years of displacement, migration, violence, and settlement that bring us together here today. Jerusalem. Jerusalem, it's not my city, and it never will be my city. While I was researching and writing this book, I was very aware of 150 years of, maybe more, 175 or 200 years of people like me standing at my shoulder behind me, white, English-speaking, middle-aged, middle-class, men, in particular men, claiming Jerusalem for themselves or for their nation, or in Britain's case, for their empire, or for their religion, sometimes Christianity, and then proceeding to tell everybody else, often at great length and often in print, why their claim to Jerusalem matters so very, very much indeed. That's not why I've done what I've done, as I hope you'll see if you get a chance to read this book. I wrote it because I could see an imbalance in narratives about Jerusalem in my culture, English-speaking culture. And as Franas very kindly said, you know, I'm lucky to have a platform from which to speak, and I wanted to use it to help redress the balance. But that's a tricky word, balance. We hear it most often in relation to the news media, and it conjures these images of a seesaw. It implies there are two sides. In this case, you know, an Israeli side, which is very often conflated with Jewish, and a Palestinian side. And the wisdom runs, if you devote equal resources to both sides, then the seesaw will be level. You know, you will have achieved balance. But as I set out to show in this book, Jerusalem has many more sides than two. It would be misleading to reduce Jerusalem to two sides. Ideas of two sides, and also ideas about those two sides being irreconcilable, are a fiction. And any balance that may result from treating them equally will never be an equitable balance, because Israel has the overwhelmingly larger proportion of resources, assets, status, power, visibility, money. The seesaw is not level to begin with. So to achieve an equitable balance, you have to act unequally. So in this book, I haven't taken equal numbers of stories about Jewish people and Jewish Jerusalem and everybody else and set them against each other. This book favors those who begin with fewer advantages. I'm choosing to amplify the voices of the unlistened to. I'm very, very lucky indeed through my life to have been visiting Jerusalem since I was a child, 40 something years ago. My first visit was in 1980. And then in 1982, my father, amazingly, arranged for me to have my bar mitzvah twice. Once in the synagogue that we used at home in London, and then again at the Western Wall in Jerusalem. And I've been coming back all my life, traveling, living, working, visiting. This, I put an image on the screen, this is the old city of Jerusalem, which, as you'll know, I'm sure many people in this audience will know, it's the area at the center of the larger city in the occupied sector of East Jerusalem, which has been annexed by Israel, where most of the holy places are concentrated. And I should add that it's not a big place. You know, the area, these walls are still extant. They're about 450 years old. The area inside the walls is less than a half of 1 square mile. About 35,000 people live there, 90% of whom are Palestinian. So one motivation for me for writing the book was, you know, on all those visits over my teens and 20s and 30s and 40s, was seeing how people like me, outsiders, onlookers, tourists, pilgrims, visitors, would encounter the people for whom that place is home, who live and work in the old city, who run a business, who take their kids to school in the morning and back again in the evening, who are looking for somebody to, I don't know, fix their bathroom, or who are going to buy a saucepan for their kitchen or whatever. The people who live alongside the holy places. Because Jerusalem is the most famous city in the world, many people who visit come either with an idea of what it should be like, or they come expecting some sort of paradise of spiritual perfection. The city does not match up on either score. But what tends to happen, and what I could see happening, was that visitors would be marginalizing the people who call this place home. The people ended up too often being seen as being less important than the holy places. I thought that was wrong. And I thought for a long time about how to write about that, how to address that, how to undermine it and deconstruct it. Another motivation for me was seeing how the reality of the old city didn't match up to the maps that people like me, outsiders and the tourists and visitors, were using. These are two images which I put on the screen. I've taken them from the internet, but they're from news media, but they're very similar to tourist maps that you might see in guidebooks or brochures. And what you have invariably is the old city divided into 4: Christian quarter, Muslim quarter, Armenian quarter, Jewish quarter, very often with these sharp, clear lines of division in between. I mean, in these cases, they're, you know, color coded even to heighten the sense of difference. But as you'll know, if you spent any time in Jerusalem, and many people in this audience will have done, there is no dividing line between the Muslim quarter and the Christian quarter, say. That line on that map there is a street. Schaanerzeit. It's a very beautiful street, shopping street, very busy. It's not very wide. It's like 3 or 4 yards wide. There are shops on both sides. There are people on both sides. There's lots of commerce and traffic. It's not really both sides. It's just a street. The sense of exclusivity is quite wrong. There are churches in the Muslim quarter. There are mosques in the Jewish quarter. There are people living everywhere. But people approaching Jerusalem for the first time might imagine, sitting at home, looking at my map, this is a holy city. They might imagine that this is a city which has been divided into holy quarters, that these quarters have some kind of basis in spirituality or something. That's a mistake. But from that mistake, it's then the short step to the next mistake, which is thinking that perhaps Christians say aren't even allowed into the Muslim quarter, or that Jews may not enter the Armenian quarter or something. So you have a situation where an outsider, a visitor who may be Christian or Jewish or whatever, thinks that, say, the Muslim quarter is off limits to me. It's somehow enemy territory. I shouldn't go there at all, which is quite wrong. These sorts of maps, I think, to me, they're a very Western conception. They're rooted in ideas of a nation state. With my references, in my head, they look to me like an atlas of Europe, where all the countries of Europe lock together very nicely along these lines of division. Or while I was preparing this talk for the US, it also reminded me of a point in the West where Utah and Colorado and Arizona and New Mexico all meet at a four corners point. And that's very instructive, of course, because what's invisible in that formulation are the Native American lands, in that case of the Navajo and the Hopi people and others, which were erased by the US state borders. And in a similar way, in the Jerusalem context, what we see with these maps is they are also erasing an indigenous reality of the city. So where did this idea come from? I started to try and do some research. So there's a whole other course of talks that can be given about the history of cartography in Jerusalem. It's kind of too much for today. I've reduced it to one slide and a couple of minutes of talking. So these are some early maps of Jerusalem. That one at the top is the oldest one that we still have that's surviving today. That's a mosaic, which is laid on the floor of a church in what's now Jordan. That's from the 6th century. But then from then through the Middle Ages, we tend to see Jerusalem depicted in this sort of idealized form, sometimes as a perfect circle there on the bottom right, which is drawn from a biblical reference, or with the other ones as a sort of European style castle or a fortified enclave. Maps at this point were idealized representations of place. People wouldn't use them to travel. People would travel by word of mouth, with local guides, with local knowledge, traveling on local routes. Maps were very often drawn after you've got home safely again from your long and dangerous journey. They were used as a way to depict how an individual, or sometimes a community, conceived of the journey and its destination. But similarly, all through this era, we have Arabic sources that speak of Jerusalem not as a sort of European castle, but as a mixed cluster of neighborhoods. One historian speaks of 39 quarters of Jerusalem in the 13th, 14th century. Another one describes 18 quarters of Jerusalem in 1495. These were organic. These were neighborhoods that had developed from the bottom up. And that situation lasted through to Napoleon. So in 1798, Napoleon invades first Egypt and then Palestine. He brings with him, as well as military forces, he brings artists and scholars and scientists and explorers. And there's this surge of interest in Arab and Turkish culture across Europe. And we see very shortly afterwards the first map of Jerusalem based not in these idealized forms, but on measurements taken in the field, which is that one, which dates from 1818. There's loads to say about these maps. Looking at old maps and investigating all of this stuff is fantastic. I love it. And there's a lot to say about this one in particular, but I'm focusing in on the story we're telling today. I've highlighted just in the middle there, the only label on this map referring to ethno-religious settlement within the city. That's Judenstadt, or Jewish city, Jewish area, Jewish quarter. This one is the next major advance in the mapping of Jerusalem. This is 1835. Again, there's lots to say about this map, but the only quarter, again, that which I've highlighted there is Jews' quarter, although we start to see now labels for the Armenian convent and the Latin convent and the Greek convent. These are areas of Christian settlement which reflect European concerns as Europeans are encountering Jerusalem in greater numbers for the first time and exploring the nature of the city. And then came a map in 1837, and we have a Jewish quarter again, but now we have a Turkish quarter, Armenian quarter, a Greek quarter, a Latin quarter. As far as I'm aware, this is the first time that these names appear on a map. And this period, the 1830s, was a time of political upheaval in Jerusalem and in, excuse me, all of Palestine. There had been a rebellion led from Egypt, which had challenged Ottoman rule. There was a popular uprising in Palestine, which led to a power vacuum. You had European powers jockeying for position, trying to restore order, but also trying to take advantage of the instability to advance their own interests. This is a period when we see foreign consulates and embassies opening in Jerusalem for the first time. And then in 1840, following a failed diplomatic initiative, Britain did what Britain tends to do at these points in history. Britain came in and bombed Palestine, basically into submission, and then handed Palestine back to the Ottomans. But British forces remained. So there was a team of Royal Engineers who were tasked with surveying the terrain of Palestine up and down the coast. And in 1841, two of them arrived to survey Jerusalem. But that conflict of 1840 wasn't only about geopolitics. British evangelical Protestant missionaries had long had their eye on the unevangelized people of the Ottoman Empire. They were unable to convert Muslims because Islamic law, Ottoman law at that time, stipulated death for people who converted away from Islam. They were unable to convert Catholics or Orthodox Christians, partly because there was little willingness in those communities to convert, but also partly because France was protecting Catholic rights and Imperial Russia was protecting Orthodox rights. So if you start to mess with the communal balance, you kick off a diplomatic row, which Britain at that point wanted to avoid. And there had long been, and there still is, a strain in Protestant evangelical thinking that sees the conversion of the Jews as being a prelude to the second coming of Christ. At this time, we see all British efforts going into converting the Jews, which meant that the Brits needed to know exactly who lived where in order to be able to target their evangelizing mission. So we see Britain at this time appointed the first Protestant bishop of Jerusalem, who was a man called Michael Alexander. Appropriate enough, he was formerly a rabbi, and he converted away from Judaism to Christianity. He arrived in 1842. With him, though, was a young chaplain by the name of George Williams. And George Williams was only 27 at this time, and he was only in Jerusalem for just over a year, and then he was posted elsewhere. And in 1849, he published a new edition of his book, The Holy City, and it included a map which had been drawn from the Royal Engineers survey of a few years previously. But Williams added all the labeling to it, including Christian quarter, Muslim quarter, Armenian quarter, Jewish quarter. As far as I can tell, George Williams was the instigator of the idea of dividing Jerusalem into four quarters. Maps before him did not show them. And just about every single map ever made since does show them. I won't bore you, but I could show a tide of maps from the 19th and 20th centuries, from European cartographers and American cartographers, all of which include the four quarters. There's a direct line from George Williams in 1849 to the maps of Jerusalem that we all see and use today, reinforced in the media, in literature, in academia, in guidebooks, on tourist maps, in every conceivable medium. Why? has this idea of the four quarters survived. It survived because it suits the colonial ambitions of successive waves of the rulers of Jerusalem, right down to our own time. The quarters are false. They were invented by a 19th century British missionary. They always were false, but it suited Jerusalem's colonizers to divide the city's populations against themselves, to foster sectarian division. And, you know, Williams himself, this is an extract from his book, even he was aware that he was deliberately marginalizing the lived experience of Jerusalem's own people. If you remember the 39 quarters from the 13th century and the 18 quarters from 1495, and if you think today even of all of the communities and the different ethnicities and religions and social identifications of all the people who live and work inside the old city, for Williams, and for all of Jerusalem's map makers since, they are all, as it says here, highlighted at the bottom, numerous, but unimportant. I beg to differ, you know. Those subdivisions, which reflect the mixed nature of the city's population, are very, very important. As a journalist, I'm specifically interested in how we think of Jerusalem when we only ever see it as being depicted, divided into sectarian, ethno-religious quarters. So, to return to the map, I just want to try and take in some of Jerusalem's many, many marginalized communities of today, each of which I've highlighted with a yellow blob on the map on the left there. I was very lucky to spend some time talking to and writing about the people at the Indian hospice. Jerusalem has many, many of these hospices, and in this context, the word hospice refers to a Muslim religious institution, specifically one that's related to mystical Islam, Sufism. This is a really fascinating place. It commemorates a legendary visit to Jerusalem about 800 years ago by Baba Farid, who is one of India's most celebrated mystics. He's supposed to have meditated here for 40 days. And there is still a cave and a small mosque inside the boundaries of the Indian hospice, which is now home to a little cluster of Indian Palestinian families. Or really, it's really one extended Indian Palestinian family with different branches to it. Just nearby is the Afghaniya hospice and the Bukhariya hospice, which are built back to back to each other, which create a little community with this centuries-long tradition of hosting Muslims from Bukhara and the neighboring lands of Central Asia, Uzbeks and Tajiks and Turkmen, and Afghans and Uyghurs and others. Just nearby to that is a neighborhood that's home to Jerusalem's Dom families, who self-identify as gypsies. So that word, gypsy, has a troubled history in English. It was invented around the 15th century or so in England, because English people were looking at these newcomers who were arriving amongst them, and they didn't know who they were or where they came from, and they thought they had come from Egypt, so they called them gypsies as a truncation of Egyptians. But over the years, the word has taken on pejorative meanings. Some people choose not to use it at all today, and they would refer to themselves in different ways. But in English, the Dom of Jerusalem choose to self-identify with the word gypsy. So in this case, I'm following their lead. And their history, which is very under-researched and very underwritten, begins with waves of migration 1,500 years ago, not out of Egypt, but out of India. And the Dom have lived inside the walls of Jerusalem for 200 years or more. But inevitably, as with other similar communities in Europe and elsewhere, they suffer appallingly from racism and from discrimination, partly because of their self-identification. They do not identify as Israeli, and they also do not identify as Palestinian. They are Dom. They occupy this tiny socio-political stroke economic space between the two larger communities. And as a result, they suffer very badly from both. The situation's really bad for them. The Dom children hardly ever graduate from high school. Unemployment rates within the community are very high, 2/3 or more. Jobs where they exist tend to be very menial jobs. They tend to be service jobs related to sewer work or drain cleaning. It's a terrible situation. This woman on the screen is called Amun Slim. She is extraordinary, amazing person. I was very, very lucky indeed to meet her, and she was very generous in sharing her time and her stories with me over quite a period. She has done extraordinary work over 20 years or more, building community support structures among the Dom within her own community. She started in 1999, sort of distributing blankets and distributing help to underprivileged families. And she now has and runs a small community center in Shuafat, which is just outside the walls of the old city to the north. And it's one of those places that's kind of always busy. You know, there's always something going on. She's running after school clubs for children to put children through school with extra tuition in math or Arabic or English or whatever. She runs vocational training classes for the women of her community. She runs literacy classes. She runs language classes. She's trying to improve, and very often is succeeding in improving hope and opportunity within her community. And inevitably, she's facing opposition, not only from the Israeli authorities, and not only from Palestinian society because of who she is and who her community is, but she's also facing opposition from within her community because she's a woman and she's standing up against patriarchal structures of authority within her own community and breaking gender barriers. She's an amazing person. She's one of those people who has a sort of, you know, they have an electricity about them. They're able to infuse people around them to achieve extraordinary things. I was very lucky to talk to her, and I was very grateful indeed that I was able to give some space in my book to give her story and the story of her community a little bit extra visibility. Talking of racism and discrimination, there's also a center of African settlement in the old city, as you can see on the map, right at the gates of Al-Aqsa. This is a community of around 450 Muslim people who have origins in West Africa and in Central Africa. This man is Musa Qaus, who volunteers at the African Community Center there. While I was, you know, listening to these stories and collating some of this for the book, I was increasingly struck by the idea, you know, all of this serves to reinforce the notion that if your history of Jerusalem doesn't include Black history, Dom history, Indian history, yeah, its very broadest definition, Arab history, that's not a history of Jerusalem at all. This lady is Maysoon Al-Maslahi. She's Palestinian, but her family originates from Morocco and Algeria. She's one of the very last remnants of Jerusalem's Moroccan quarter, which was flattened by Israel in 1967 in order to create the huge plaza that we now see in front of the Western Wall. This is, to tell it in full, is a long and horrifying story. We don't have time, unfortunately, today for a long and horrifying story, but I will try and give you a short version, which involves a few images and a few minutes of your time, if I can do that. Maysoon has her hand in that picture resting on the tomb of supposedly the North African mystic and saint Abu Madian, who, according to legend, was in Jerusalem in 1187 fighting alongside Salah ad-Din against the Crusaders. Maybe he was, maybe he wasn't. The dates don't quite work out. Abu Madian at that time would have been a very old man. Maybe he wouldn't have been in the foreground of battle. We're not quite sure. The tomb of Abu Madian himself is pretty well attested in Algeria. this may be the tomb of his grandson, also Abu Marjan, who we know from documentary evidence in the Waqf was in Jerusalem slightly later. Who exactly it was, and whatever, where the facts are when you go back that far, it's quite hard to pin down. Either way, at that time, around the end of the 12th century, was when land in this part of the city was given over for a North African or Moroccan neighborhood. And that neighborhood lasted through to the 20th century. So here you can see there's a comparison image taken from the same vantage point 80 years or so apart. And you can see I've circled in yellow the Moroccan quarter, the houses and streets as they were, and then the empty space that is the plaza today in front of the Western Wall. And here's another shot, another comparison shot taken from the air, showing the same images, the same sort of treatment. There's the Moroccan neighborhood you can see circled. So at that time of the neighborhood's establishment in the 12th century, the Western Wall didn't mean much in terms of Jewish religious practice. There's almost no mention of it in Jewish sources. It was, and it still is, a Muslim holy place. It's traditionally the place where the Prophet Muhammad tethered the winged horse-like animal Buraq that brought him to Jerusalem from Mecca on his legendary night journey. And the wall became important, extremely important, overridingly important as a Jewish holy place from about the 16th century, when the Ottoman Sultan Suleiman deliberately made Jerusalem more attractive for Jewish settlement at a time when many places in Europe were expelling their Jewish populations. So there were always, of course, synagogues in Jerusalem. But before Suleiman, in this period that we're looking at here, Jewish public observance was restricted to the Mount of Olives, which is off this image on the left-hand side, and also to the Golden Gate, which is also on the left here. Both of those are outside the city walls, but they were as close as Jews could get, were allowed to get, to the site of the former temple, which is now where the mosque is. What Suleiman did was, first, he established a Muslim cemetery outside the Golden Gate, along that line, long line of the wall there, which is, that cemetery is still there today. He did it to block Jewish prayer at that location. And then instead, I've sort of drawn this big looping arrow on the map. What he did was he tried to bring Jewish public observance kind of all the way around and into the city walls by opening access to a stretch of the western wall of the mosque compound, or what's known as the Temple Mount area. And that's even closer to the site of the former temple. So the way Suleiman did it was by creating an alleyway beside the wall and behind the last row of houses in the Moroccan quarter. And there it is. On the bottom left, you can see highlighted in yellow down there. This is an aerial image taken in about 1931. You can see the alleyway. You can see people in the alleyway praying at the Western Wall. And you can see the streets and houses of the Moroccan quarter stretching behind it. So Suleiman didn't bring Jewish observance into the city kind of out of the goodness of his heart or something. This wasn't a grand ecumenical vision of coexistence or something. He did it for very specific political and economic reasons, but it lasted right through to the 20th century. So in 1948, in a part of this story which is much better known than what I've told previously and what I'll tell in the next few minutes, there was terrible destruction near here, just off this image on the screen on the right-hand side, in the fighting between Jordanian forces and Jewish Zionist paramilitaries over the Jewish quarter. Homes were destroyed, synagogues were destroyed, people were killed, families were expelled en masse. But the Moroccan quarter itself was not targeted. And so in about 1961, 62, in the early 60s, Suleiman's alleyway in front of the Western Wall looked like this under the Jordanians. And then in 1967, Israel bombarded and occupied the old city. One day after the Israeli army seized the Western Wall, in this very famous image on the left-hand side, on the right, Israel's former Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion visited the site. First, he said that the old city walls should be pulled down. Thankfully, that didn't happen. And then he said that the houses of the Moroccan Quarter, which are just off the image here on the right-hand side, just by his shoulder, should be demolished to clear space in front of the wall for Jewish prayer. A plan was drawn up. The following night, Israeli soldiers stormed through the neighborhood, shouting, banging on doors. Men with sledgehammers went in first, and then bulldozers worked through the night. And then by morning, there was nothing left. So the whole neighborhood, 700 years old or so, was rubble. People fled for their lives. One woman is reported to have been killed because she was deaf, and so she didn't hear the shouting and the banging, and she died when her house was demolished around her. 32 years later, an Israeli army engineer who was present at this operation that night went on record, and he said that that night workers had discovered several more what he called Arab corpses. Some were removed, but others, he says, were just bulldozed into the dirt where they lay. So presumably, and I've not been able to find this out for sure, presumably they are still there today beneath the paving which now covers this plaza space. This is a horrible story. And it's a horrible story which is unfortunately much less known about than another horrible story of Jordan's dreadful actions in the Jewish Quarter in 1948, where people had also fled for their lives in the face of widespread destruction. So the building that Maysoon looks after, which is just on the edge of the plaza, just by an Israeli checkpoint, is just about the only one to have survived 1967. There's a small anonymous doorway. You go through, there's a little courtyard with patterned tiles. You go up some stairs. There are 6 families living around the courtyard there, supported unusually for Jerusalem by the Moroccan Waqf. And there's a small mosque on an upper level where Maysoon takes care of the tomb of a saint, mostly hidden, mostly ignored. A few steps away is the tailoring outlet of this chap, Sami Barsoum, who is the mayor of the Syriac Christian community, not Syrian, but they're an ethnic group who belong to a homeland which is in the borderlands between modern-day Iraq and Syria and Turkey, what some people might think of as Kurdistan, but it's not. Well, they're not Kurdish. They belong to a church which uses the Syriac language, which is one of the dialects of Aramaic, which was a lingua franca across the Middle East before Arabic. So this image sort of just highlights the nonsense of that idea of exclusivity in the quarters. Maysoon's house and the mosque that she looks after are inside what's now called the Jewish Quarter, but she is not Jewish. Sami lives and works and prays inside what's now called the Armenian Quarter, but he is not Armenian. And this goes across boundaries as well. This chap is Avi Yefet, who is the caretaker of the Karaite synagogue, which is probably the oldest one still functioning inside the walls of the old city. It was originally established in the 8th century. And there's yet another fascinating story of the Karaite Jews who are rejected as not being Jewish by all of mainstream Judaism and also by the Israeli state as well. Very briefly, mainstream Judaism draws 2 sources of divine authority for the religion. One is the written Torah, which is more familiar perhaps as the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible. And the other is the Oral Torah, which is a collection of commentaries and interpretations by the rabbis, which were collated and written down for the first time about 1500 years ago as the Talmud. So mainstream Judaism draws both as being sources of divine authority. Karaite Judaism rejects the authority of the rabbis as being divine and focuses only on the written Torah. And that leads to a number of differences in doctrine and practice between mainstream Judaism and Karaite Judaism. There are many, one of which is very visual, actually. If you go to this place, the synagogue is now so old that the ground level has risen around it, so it's now underground. Were you to go there, there's a little courtyard again, and you have to go down steps, 23 steps, to reach the synagogue. They generally don't like non-Karaite Jews to go in. Were you to be able to go in, like any Karaite synagogue anywhere in the world, you would leave your shoes at the door. The space inside the synagogue has no furniture. It's just a carpeted empty space. Forms of worship include these styles of devotion which are now explicitly banned in mainstream Judaism, like kneeling and prostrating and touching your forehead to the carpet to pray. You know, there are obvious visual and also spiritual parallels between Karaite religious practice and Islamic religious practice. You talk to one side and they say, well, they copied us. And then you talk to other people and they'll tell you, well, they copied us. Who copied who? If anyone copied anybody, that's a more complicated issue than I was able to get into. But the origins of Karaite and thus of Jewish religious devotion and the comparisons between that and Islam are intriguing. But the rejection means that, these communities who identify as Jewish, self-identify as Jewish, are deemed as not being Jewish at all by every other Jew in the world, if you like, mainstream Judaism organizations, and also the Israeli state as well, like I said. And in a place like Israel that runs on these hierarchies of ethno-religious identification, that's a serious issue. Karaite marriage, for instance, is still outlawed in Israel. There's lots more that I want to say. I've got more than half an eye on the time. I'm just going to end, if I can, just with one point. The Palestinians of Jerusalem are under intense pressure. I don't have to explain to this audience in particular the significance of what Israel is doing in places like Sheikh Jarrah and Silwan and a dozen other places in Jerusalem to try and make life there untenable for anyone who is not Jewish. So, as well as for the people of Jerusalem, I wanted to use my platform to write this book for my own generation of onlookers. I'm 53, people in their 40s and 50s and 60s and 70s, to try and tell them that the stories that they grew up with about Jerusalem, about the four quarters and the sectarian division, about how this is supposedly a war of equals, or about how it's some age-old hatred between religions that can never be solved, or how it's a conflict between two sides rather than what it is, which is an occupation by one side of another. How all of that is wrong. My generation needs to change its ideas in order that the next generation are better able to effect change. So, these stories of mystics and tombs and all the different communities of Jerusalem, they're fun, and I love them. And they humanize the people of the old city, which was part of my purpose. But another purpose of mine in writing these stories was to weaponize them. There's a job to do among all of us in terms of addressing the continued viability of how far things have been allowed to go in Israel. I'm thinking of the egregious violations of rights, the lack of any political or diplomatic accountability, the culture of impunity in the police and the army in particular, and more. And a good place to start that work, I think, is in reimagining Jerusalem without its four quarters. Thank you very much indeed for listening. Thank you. And I'm very happy to take Q&A and to move into conversation.
Okay. Great, thank you, Matthew. It's really very compelling.
Thank you.
And, I am really awestruck by so many that you said. But also, equally compelling how not surprised I am by certain things. I mean, I am from a village called Abadis, which is, right next to Jerusalem. You could see from our house, you could see the Dome of the Rock.
Sure.
Jerusalem is my city
Yeah.
in many ways. It's where I went to school. I graduated from El Ibrahimiyya, and you mentioned something about, the Arabs or the Muslims dealt with Jerusalem as a place to live, not this spiritual,
No.
kind of thing. And that's exactly what we felt. It was something when I was a teenager. It's a place where I went to school. I chased girls my age at the time, through the alleys and so on.
Okay.
And, went to all these
Did they chase you
places.
back? It's like,
Yeah, sometimes, sometimes the parents did, but,
okay, right.
so.
We'll get to
and,
those stories as well.
That's a lot of story. What I'm saying is it was a place to live. I mean, we
Right.
never really thought of it in this, sort of repressive, spiritual kind of way. It's a place to live. We loved it. We loved, the sounds when you walk on the streets and
Right.
so on. They make sound and all
Right.
these things. We love the smell. We love Kakl Quds.
Wow.
There is nothing in the world like Kakl Quds. If you know what Kakl Quds is.
You better
if like
explain,
it,
because maybe there are people on Zoom who don't know.
Imagine a bagel except a lot better, and it's a lot bigger, and has sesame, and it's something that we ate every day. You go,
Yeah.
you dip it in za'atar and so on,
Yeah.
and it's the most amazing still today. I mean, to this day, it's the same thing. I remember one time the honorable guy was calling me. I was in Baghdad. He was in Jerusalem. And he said, "You want anything?" And I said, "Maybe Kakl Quds." And he sure enough, because they flew
Can you
on
fit-
a UN flight,
Oh,
they
okay.
went to Jordan and so on. And the whole thing happened within like 2 hours. And I had fresh, warm Kakl Quds.
Amazing. Wow.
That's
That's the
what
only
Jerusalem-
person in the city to have it as well.
Yeah,
That's like, yeah.
probably, yeah. So, I mean, I have so many questions. I don't want to take a great deal of your time. I know you are pressed for time, but you raise so many things. And
Thank you.
I honestly don't know where to begin. But if I could ask you
Please.
just to re-encapsulate
Mm,
for us so
Mm.
we can understand it better,
mm.
why the 9 quarters? Because, by the
Okay.
way, I just want to tell you something. Hara in Arabic is a different thing altogether.
Yeah.
Hara means so much. It's not a quarter takes away
Yeah.
from the essence of Hara. And Hara for us means a great deal. People interacted, and so on. So
Yeah.
tell me, how did you, because I know you mentioned there were like 38 quarters at one time, 43 quarters, whatever.
Whatever.
So go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a journalist, so and you're a journalist as well.
Yes, I
So
am,
there's a
yeah.
degree of cynicism is about
Right.
to come into my answer here.
Yeah.
My point in naming 9 was to say that there are no more 4 quarters than there are 9, than there are 22, than there are 106.
Mm.
My point was to deconstruct. So I chose 9 as being, if you like, it's just a little piece of poetry or mystery. And I am afraid to say I had an eye on the bookstore browser who would be looking around, and he would see or she 9 quarters, and they would ask, well, what's he talking about 9? How can there be 9? What do you mean 9?
What do you mean?
So hopefully then they would go up, they would take the book, they would look at it, oh, this is good, and then they would go and buy it. That's the idea. So it's a little piece of a sort of like I say, a little piece of mystery. The key point is, and this is my fault because that's my title. It's caused a lot of confusion because people then say to me, what are the 9 quarters of Jerusalem? Which 9? Identify 9. There aren't 9. What I'm trying to say is there aren't 4, there aren't 9, there aren't. This is a shifting
That is the point.
nature
That's the
of
point to be made.
neighborhood. Yeah.
Right.
And the Hara, I mean, you can talk in much more eloquently than I can about the meanings and the nuances behind Hara. The nuances behind quarter in English are also, I think, interesting as well. It comes, they sort of have military overtones. It comes from Latin. It comes from Roman military camps were divided into 4 by a straight road this way and a straight road that way. And that idea sort of lingers on in English. That if you think of a term like, the headquarters, or you think of giving no quarter to an enemy, or a quartermaster is a military officer who looks after resources and supplies and whatever. There's military staff ringing in the back of the word in English. So its usage in this context, in the Jerusalem context, I think is particularly telling as well. There's a whole load of stuff which I wanted to go into in more detail and couldn't, about the texture of the words in English and also in Arabic. Hada is a rich word, right? It's full of meaning.
Right. Lots of life.
Yeah.
The word ham and so on. I also want to ask you before
I'm happy. Yes, I'm happy to take questions.
on a couple of things. Now, I know you almost ended with this, with the reimagining of Jerusalem. You said reimagining, and it was a question in my mind almost from the moment you began. Give us a moment in Jerusalem history when conflict was not relevant to the daily life of Jerusalem, and reimagine for us, if you could share with us, how Jerusalem would be today, free of conflict.
Wow. I've been going around the US for like 3 weeks. I've been speaking virtually every day for the last 3 weeks. That, and I'm almost at the end of my tour, that's a beautiful question of all of the tour that I've been making. Thank you for asking that question. A time when there was no conflict. I'm gonna go back. I mean, I don't have enough knowledge. I'm not enough of a historian. I'm not enough of an academic scholar to give you a full picture of what life was like. But I'm going to go back to pre-Crusades. So a time, say, in the end of the 11th century or so. Al-Ghazali, who need no introduction to some people. He's a Muslim philosopher, very famous writer and thinker in Islam. Had some kind of a nervous breakdown in Baghdad, in his home city. He was a very eminent scholar. He was a university professor. And in 1095, he found himself increasingly fraught by questions of philosophy. And he found himself standing in front of his class, unable to speak. He was struck mute in the lecture hall. He eventually resolved it by he sold all his property and he sold all his wealth and everything, and he set off on foot. He told his colleagues he was going to go on Hajj. He went to Damascus and then he came to Jerusalem and he started writing his great epic work, The Revival of the Religious Sciences. But he was there in just pre-Crusaders. The Crusaders stormed through in 1099 and he was there in 1096. I have an idea in my head that that point was a time where conflict was not at the top of Jerusalem's agenda. There was a degree of social stability. There was a degree of economic stability. The great geographer Muqaddasi was writing a little before that, a century or so before that, and he wrote very evocatively about the produce of his home city. I may be wrong because I'm not a specialist, certainly not in the 11th century, but I have a feeling if there was a time that I'd like to go back to see what Jerusalem was like, I would like to hang out with Al-Ghazali and see what was going on in the city at that period. And you asked, sorry, the second part of your question.
The second part is, how would you reimagine it?
How would I imagine it
without
today?
conflict?
Wow. The way to reimagine it today without conflict is to imagine an evening up of the imbalance which I referred to at the beginning of my talk. I would hope for an equity in rights between all the peoples of the city, all the peoples of the wider area. And obviously I would hope for a removal of the occupation and the military presence and the hostile surveillance and the economic suppression which is going on and has been going on for far too long.
Can you share with us how, lost in reporting on Jerusalem is Jerusalemites. Jerusalemites are always lost in discussing of Jerusalem. It's always, like you mentioned, it's always a military thing, it's quarter this and so on. And it goes way back. It was always viewed and functioned in these terms through conflict and militarism and all these things. But there are, 300,000 more, 350,000 Palestinian in East Jerusalem.
Mm.
And they really struggle to keep their homes, to
Mm.
keep their, properties and so on. And
Yeah.
it's very difficult. I mean,
Yeah.
sometimes they are sort of, they try to be lured, or they try to lure them by huge amounts of money, for
Right.
instance,
Right.
and other times by all the military stuff and so on, and the checkpoints and the restrictions and all this. How did you manage, or did you have time to sort of reflect on the intimacy of the way you dealt with people, the actual people, that
Mm.
the way they go about their life
Mm.
day after day?
Mm. People were, I found, invariably amazingly generous with their time,
Right.
and with their willingness to share some of the details of their life, how they live in Jerusalem, what, as you said at the beginning, what Jerusalem means to them on an everyday basis. There's a degree, of course, of suspicion. I'm white and I'm British and I'm a journalist. Journalists have done an awful lot of damage to the society of Jerusalem, and particularly to Palestinian society over the years. So there is a degree of resistance, and a degree of gaining trust, which is very important. And gaining trust is often done just through time and through conversation and through repeated encounter. But once that, if you like to call it, ice has been broken, or once those barriers have been breached, people are enormously open-hearted. People were willing, because, if you're taking a step out of your comfort zone, if you can be identified as somebody who's started in a place which is different and is reaching out, is taking a step towards another person, trying to meet them on their terms, trying to listen to them in their words, trying to understand their place through their eyes. If you make that step in good faith, people respond inevitably warmly. And that's what I found in Jerusalem as well.
Yeah. By the way, I mean, just to comment on the picture that you showed,
Mm.
I think that Muslims emulated the Jews, with their prayer and so on,
Right.
simply by virtue of Judaism has been around for, thousands of years before Islam. So that is only logical.
be.
There's a lot of things,
It may
a
be.
lot of similarities in Islam, and I think Muslims
Hmm.
have to embrace this rather than turn it into another point of conflict, which they do not need. By the way, how are these people treated in terms of? You said they are not treated as Jews and so on. Do they serve in the military, for instance? Do they have an Israeli citizenship? But what does it say? Is it like, let's say, the Arab citizens of Israel and so on?
As far as I'm aware, no. As far as I'm aware, they're full citizens without differentiation, and they do serve in the army. The point of difference is a religious point of
It's
difference.
actually the worship aspect.
Yeah, as far as I'm aware.
I see. I think Siham. Yeah. Do you have any questions? Because I don't want to suck all the oxygen.
That's all right. That's absolutely
because
fine.
I don't know how much time you have.
I don't know what the
I
time
could
is.
ask
but
you
yeah.
1,000 questions. So I don't want to.
I'm happy
take
to
it all.
answer, to
Do
give
you-
1,000
you want
answers.
To ask
Is it 2:00?
Matthew anything, or?
Or- Feel free to ask a question.
But, so you talked about the different.
Come
groups,
closer.
Like the African.
Mm.
How are they also treated politically? So
Yeah.
You talked about discrimination and so. forth,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
How are they treated politically? By the Israelis?
Hmm.
Because many of them identify as Palestinians.
Right. Oh,
Yeah,
yeah. We're
yeah.
Big fan. Barnawi family.
The Barnawi family is very famous, yeah. Yeah, yeah.
I mean, it's.
I mean, with the Dom, Amun, the woman who I highlighted, has a line which she gives, which is quite hard hitting, and depending on the terminology she uses, she kind of varies the terminology. I'll give you the clean version. She says, there's a term for the Dom, nawar, which is you'll know in Arabic,
Yes.
which is
No.
a racist
Right.
slur, and is used almost universally against them. And Amun comes out with this line. She says, the Israelis treat us like Arabs, and the Arabs treat us like nawar,
Right.
which is
Wow.
appalling. So
That is-
she feels to be at the bottom of the heap, politically and economically and socially.
yeah, that's-
Sorry.
No, I'm sorry, I was, no, because somebody wants to buy a book.
Oh, please, sorry. Yeah, yeah.
How much time we?
I don't know, what time do we think?
We don't want to, you know.
It's a little after 2. I'm really sorry to say that I do kind of have to run very, very soon,
Can I,
but please.
have a question? Because I know you were asking a lot of questions. You have a quick question.
Yeah, I wanted to, just because you were saying the sense of.
Tell us
home.
your name,
Oh,
Oh,
Anthony.
Anthony.
Here.
Anthony Kerr, okay.
Nice to meet you, thank
It
you.
was- So it was just more of like the sense of like home that
Mm.
you were talking about.
Yeah,
So living in Bethlehem, so I lived in Bethlehem most of my life.
Okay.
And I always spent like Jerusalem,
Mm,
I've been to Jerusalem probably like 3 or 4 times. in
Right.
my whole life.
right,
So I just feel like whenever I have gone to Jerusalem,
Yeah.
it's just the exact same thing. When you see tourists coming to Jerusalem.
yeah,
Feel like, oh, wow, this is like.
yeah,
so
yeah,
cool. This is like the place where Jesus was.
yeah,
born,
yeah, yeah, yeah,
Or Jesus
Walked
walked, the 14
or-
stages,
Yeah.
the Holy Sepulchre Church, the 4 quarters, etc.
Mm,
And as you were saying, how it's like just for me, how to just meant like the playground I used to play with.
Okay.
You do
Okay.
everything.
And just coming to Jerusalem, I feel like a tourist myself. So I wanted to ask you, since you've been to Jerusalem way many more times than me, and I just want to say, does that sense of home feel to you right now? Or do you feel as a tourist every time you go back?
That's a really interesting question. Thank you for asking that question. I want to, first of all, before I answer fully, I just want to say how I'm, note how unfair it is
Yeah.
that I am free to move as much as I want in whatever direction, into the city, out of the city, into the country, out of the country at will, because of the layers of privilege that I have, a British passport, the name that I have, the background, the religious background, family background that I have, all of those layers of privilege, and how unfair it is,
Yeah.
and how it should be you being able to move as freely as you want. Having said that, as I said right at the beginning, it's important for me to note that Jerusalem is not my home. It's not home to me. It never was home to me, and it never will be home to me, because I'm an outsider. I come from outside. I'm looking at the city from a different perspective, and I'm very careful and very explicit in not claiming a patch of it as mine, if you like. So I feel when I visit, at least in some areas, that it's familiar. I'm not a stranger anymore, which is an amazing feeling to have. But it's not home. It's not mine. It's yours or yours or yours or yours.
I just wanted to ask because I've seen how, like, yeah, when you know more of a place, like you could go from one country to another, and after living there or like visiting there for more years, you call it like, oh, this is my home now. So I just wanted to see what sense of home that you have. Going through some.
I'm a visitor.
Someone that is inhabitants from a lower Bethlehem.
I think even if you don't set foot in the place, because of the bureaucratic restrictions imposed by Israel, lots of people like yourself, it's very difficult to enter the city. It's very difficult to be there, to spend any time there. But it's still more home for those people and for you than it is for me. And that's as it should be.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you very much,
This is the
Saeed.
most compelling presentation. It has, of course, very special meaning to me. And we hope that you will join us here again.
I would love to. I would
love.
love to, in person
but
or
our aspect,
over the
via
internet or
Zoom,
whatever. Yeah.
We live in a sort of virtual world. So
It's
we
all
can do it.
connected. Yeah.
Yeah, and
Thank you
best of
very,
luck.
very much.
I hope you have a very successful
Thank
career.
you.
Thank you.